And if you're staying in here, open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 41. And that's where we will pick up in the story of Joseph. Story that we began a few weeks ago. We kind of pick up the story of Joseph this morning in a wonderful place. It's a great spot in the story because it's sort of the turning point at the end of all the waiting. That is kind of the place in the story where we'd like to skip to sometimes in our stories of waiting. We'd like to skip to the turning point that signals the end of all the waiting. And after years and years of wondering how long this would last, Joseph saying, "How long will I remain in this pit, in this dungeon?" One day, Joseph wakes up, and it's a morning like any other morning, but what he doesn't know is that Pharaoh has had a dream. He's been wrestling with dreams from the night before, and suddenly Joseph is called up, and he's shaved, and he's given a change of clothes, and in an instant, he is taken from the pit to the palace. I mean, just like that. He's taken from a slave's chains to a king's reign, from prison stripes to royal robes. He goes from misfortune to magnificence, from manacles to majesty. I got more. You want me to keep going? But oh, how devastating that kind of transformation can be to a person. It's actually a dangerous thing, isn't it? To be thrust suddenly into a position of power and wealth and prestige. It doesn't always bode well for people. Joseph, he had to learn how to cope with the dungeon, how to cope with betrayal and suffering, how to remain faithful when everything had been taken away from him. But now he faces the exact opposite test, doesn't he? Now he must learn to cope with wealth and status and power. Now he must remain faithful when everything is given to him. That's not a task that just anybody is suited for. And yet God had been shaping Joseph's character over many years in the crucible of suffering for this exact moment. Now, it's not that we're told exactly how Joseph had been transformed by his struggles or how he had matured in his struggles, because we're not given any real defects of character that needed to be worked out in Joseph. But what we do know by experience is that character isn't usually formed by immediate, overnight success, but rather it's forged in the fire of failure and under the pressure of perseverance. And when someone is given overnight success, often they lack the humility, maturity, resilience that comes from having to endure the journey all along the way. But not Joseph. To those in the palace that day, it probably looked like Joseph was an overnight success. He would have chuckled at that, though. He goes suddenly from shackles to signet ring. But Joseph's overnight success was neither of those things in reality, was it? No, it was neither overnight, for he had been through 13 years of preparation for this moment, nor was it true success if we measure success from God's perspective, because the goal to be achieved was actually not the power and authority. That wasn't the goal. There was actually a much larger goal than just Joseph's exaltation here. And Joseph is just beginning to grasp what that is as he hears Pharaoh's dream for the first time. And let's read on the rest of the story after he hears the dream and begins giving Pharaoh advice. In verse 33, this is in Genesis 41. Verse 33 says, "And now let Pharaoh," this is Joseph speaking, "and now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zephanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. So Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was way beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." And the second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. My guess is that if you had asked Joseph on the last morning he woke up in the dungeon, if you could ask God just for one thing right now, what would it be? I think Joseph would likely have said, "Get me out of this dungeon." A lesser person or a person of lesser character might have said, "Give me revenge on the people who put me here. I've got a list." I don't know what Joseph would have asked for. I doubt he would have asked to be elevated to prime minister over Egypt. And the truth is that none of us really know what to ask for. Other than help, relief, guidance for the moment, we don't know. We don't know what's best in every situation like God does. And no one can imagine, what Joseph must have been thinking at that moment before Pharaoh, because he's got the task of telling Pharaoh about this dream that is a disastrous dream. So I'm imagining he is asking God for the right words. He's asking God for the right interpretation. And it's like all of a sudden, the bigger picture, that God's bigger purposes are revealed to him. It's probably not anything Joseph had anticipated, because up until he meets Pharaoh, Joseph doesn't really know what God's purpose is. You have to remember that the first moment Joseph learns anything about a famine, the first moment that Joseph hears anything about 7 years without food, is while he's listening to Pharaoh's dream. So we can't forget that just because we know the story, we know that Joseph was sent to Egypt to save the lives of his family and many others besides that. Joseph doesn't have any idea about all that until the moment he's standing in Pharaoh's court. As far as Joseph knows, as far as he knows in the story, his vision had only been that his brothers would bow down to him. So maybe Joseph knew maybe that one day he would be given some authority. But he didn't have any other pieces of the puzzle. And then he's standing on the precipice of power, and suddenly all the grandeur of the royal court just fades into the background because looming in the future is this devastating famine. And he sees with utter clarity what's coming. Oh no, this is bad. Something needs to be done. Someone needs to act. Someone needs to take on the monumental task of preventing what would otherwise be years of starvation. And suddenly, his dream, that had been really his only indication of God's plan at this point, that dream of people bowing down before him, is transformed. It is revealed not as an end in itself. Joseph, that dream is not the complete picture of where things were headed. That was not the final goal. That was only a stepping stone to something else. Joseph, your authority is not the end. It is the means to something more far-reaching than you could have known. You know, all the trials, all the dreams, the twists and the turns had been orchestrated, not just, Joseph, so that you might wield authority for your own sake, but so that you might steward authority for the sake of others. Joseph, your dream was not just about you. There's an amazing truth here that goes beyond just the remarkable timing of God's providence. Yes, there is a principle we've seen again and again that God's plans for you and for me will unfold in their own time, and God's preparation in the midst of the waiting should not be despised, but we should remain patient and faithful if we find ourselves in the waiting room, or as we called it last week, the training room, because you never know how God is preparing you for what's next. But we also see here a pattern in the way that God's purposes unfold. That when God prospers people, he prospers them for his own purposes and often for the sake of others. That when God grants someone authority, it is not for their own benefit, but rather for the benefit of other people whom God wants to bless. This is the story of Jesus, isn't it? That God would give up authority, come to earth in the person of Jesus, but then Jesus would be raised, exalted to the highest level, given the name that is above every name. Why? Why? To bring salvation to all people. Jesus' descent and exaltation was for the benefit of others. And when you look at the Joseph story, I think it's remarkable that Joseph doesn't use his position to serve his own ends, to take revenge on Potiphar's wife, which he could have done, or to seek revenge on Potiphar or the cupbearer, or even to seek revenge on his own brothers. Joseph doesn't do that. He could have used and abused his position to settle the score with anyone who had ever crossed him. Whew, that would have been bad. I mean, he could have given the order and had them all locked up because he'd been given the signet ring, Pharaoh's own signet ring. This was the thing with the seal, you know, it had like the image that could be engraved and pressed into wax and pressed into clay. Joseph could have commanded the military, ordered troops to a certain border. He could have written a check for any amount imaginable, put that seal on it, and whatever was in Pharaoh's bank account is now at Joseph's disposal. It's like giving someone your signature. Joseph could make a decision that was national in its impact. In present-day terms, he could have gone to DFW Airport and shut down the whole thing and commandeer the planes to move grain. And yet Joseph never seems to abuse his position. What does he do? He works diligently on the task at hand. He is focused on the coming crisis. He is not given ease in the place of suffering, but work. And he uses his position to arrange things so that the most people will survive the famine. Because Joseph didn't make the mistake of thinking that his position and his power and his possessions were either from himself or for himself. He knew who it was from and who it was for. And yes, it was Pharaoh who placed the gold chain around his neck and the robe on his shoulders and the ring on his finger, but even Pharaoh is just an instrument of God's at this point. It was all from God. Joseph didn't arrange the series of events that led to his position. God sent the dreams to the cupbearer and the baker, and God sent the dreams to Pharaoh. And if those things hadn't happened, Joseph would still be in the dungeon. God was the one responsible for orchestrating all of this. There's no way that Joseph could lay claim to any of it. Especially since when he was interpreting the dreams, Joseph is entirely dependent on God, even in interpreting the dreams. He doesn't have the interpretation. He has to get that from God too. There's no entitlement here. It was all from God. How could it not be? What is it that any of us have that is not ultimately from God? There's no position, no power, no possessions that has come to you or to me apart from God giving it. God's providence is just not something you can get around. It's God who fashioned you. If you consider that, if you just, how did you get to be you? Think about that. Your DNA. It's not just the combination of your parents' genes. The DNA is actually shuffled like a deck of cards from your father and your mother to create all these new combinations. Father, mother, each have 23 pairs of chromosomes. But they can be placed in an egg, for instance, with pieces of each chromosome mixed and matched like a long string of beads where some of the sections of the strings are swapped between the pairs. And there could be 8 million combinations of chromosomes from the father and 8 million combinations of chromosomes from the mother, which makes 64 trillion different possibilities from just your father and mother. So the one combination that became you was not an accident. I'm not saying that all of who you are is determined by your DNA, only that God, in his providence, chose the combination that made you. So that you were shaped by his wisdom and you were shaped by his love. And whatever gifts you have, you receive from God's hands. He fashioned you for a purpose. He's the one who gave you your personality, who allowed you to have the intelligence or health or able body that you have, who determined the place of your birth and potential you would have and gave you the ability to sing or the ability to speak or write or craft or imagine or repair or create. He brought to you the people you would meet who would give you the opportunities you have had. Don't say, as it says in Deuteronomy, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, it says, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. Your skills, your job, your position is from him. Look at what Joseph says when he names his second child. The second son he named Ephraim. This is verse 52. He named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. God has made me fruitful. Where did all this come from? It came from God. Joseph is aware that none of this would have happened apart from God's purpose and God's providence. One can imagine that now, as he names his children, he is reflecting back on all that has happened. And he sees very clearly who it's from and who it's for, because it wasn't just for him. His position presented a choice of whether to steward what was given for God's purposes or for himself, to fall into pride or self-reliance. Did you notice that Pharaoh says something about Joseph that is rather striking? That in this man is the Spirit of God. Where can we find one like this? One in whom is the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is something we haven't heard much about in the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. In fact, this is the first time that the Spirit of God is mentioned since Genesis 1 and 2. Joseph's story begins to echo some of Adam and Eve's story here, honestly. Joseph is given dominion over all the land and its produce. The wisdom that Joseph has recalls the wisdom that Adam and Eve wanted. He is given a name, a new name, and is given a wife, just like in Genesis 2. And then he has 2 sons, similar to Adam and Eve. On the one hand, maybe this means that God hasn't given up on humanity. Yay. That's good. There's sort of an arc in Genesis. We think, oh no, at the beginning it's bad, but has God given up? No, at the end of Genesis we kind of come back around. God hasn't given up. God is still going to achieve, still purposes to achieve his ends for humans to represent and reflect his image and his presence on earth. And on the other hand, though, maybe that means this is another test. Another time where prosperity and abundance and authority are given by God, just like at the beginning, and a human has the chance to respond to this test. All prosperity is a kind of test. Will Joseph respond with trust and obedience, or will he yield to pride and self-reliance? That's our choice as well. To see our position, our abilities as a stewardship for God's purposes, or to become arrogant, believing our success is our own doing. The challenge is to remember who it's from and who it's for. Even though we might not always see the immediate significance of our work or understand the broader impact of our lives, we might not see all of that. We might be working in roles that seem mundane or disconnected from any grand narrative, but it doesn't take much imagination to see that whether you're in a corporate setting or in a classroom or in a hospital or in some other field, your integrity and your compassion and your skills and your dedication to a job or to a client, in God's hands, with God's Spirit, that can be an instrument through which God works for his purposes. It doesn't take much imagination to see how that could be. We don't always see the end, but yeah, all of these different people in different spheres working with God's wisdom, embracing God's wisdom and following God's ways and seeking his Spirit, yeah, God can use that for his purposes. I mean, the people who have had a kind of shaping influence on my own life, teachers or mentors or family members, they weren't always aware of how the Spirit was taking their words or their values or their example or their advice to lead me to where I am today. None of us really know. All I know is that whatever I've been given isn't from me, and it isn't for me. So if your position, your power, your possessions didn't come from you, but came from God, and if it's not just for you, but it's for God's purposes, then that sort of brings us full circle looking for God's purposes on the other side of the equation this week. The past 3 weeks, we've been kind of waist deep in the sufferings of Joseph, haven't we? Looking for God's purposes where? In the trials, in the hardships, in the sufferings. And now we come around to looking for God's purposes where? In the prosperity, in the exaltation of Joseph. And the fascinating thing about the Joseph story is just how interconnected those pieces were. When Joseph names Ephraim, he says, because God has made me fruitful, where? In the land of my suffering. Fruitful, prosperity, in the land of his suffering. God has done something here to change the land of suffering into a land of fruitfulness. There is a transformative power of God at work in the midst of his deepest struggles, so that the events of his past were not removed, were not all completely resolved either, but their significance was changed. When he names his firstborn son Manasseh, he says, it's because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. But clearly he doesn't forget it. Does he? I mean, he names his child this, so the name of the child, that very name will be a constant reminder of it, won't it? Does God truly erase the memory of our trials? Or does he instead redefine their impact and reassign their meaning? How has God made Joseph forget all his troubles? It must be that they don't mean the same thing to him now. God's providence and care and the blessings that God brought about in the intervening years have made it so that some of the sadness and some of the pain and some of the darkness of those events had been undone. Not least by the very children that he is naming. It's one of the striking things about having a child that you can no longer wish for a reversal of the circumstances that brought about the birth of this life. There was a movie a while back, I think, about a young man who discovers that he has the ability to go back and change or relive any moment of his life. And he finds that his father also has this ability, and it kind of runs in the family, so to speak. And as the young man discovers things that he is able to go back and change or relive, he also discovers things which really shouldn't be changed. And as it turns out, once he has a child in this movie, he realizes he can't go back and change any of the circumstances before the child's life because it will actually result in the birth of a different child. It happens to him one time. He changes something, and then he comes back, and he has a different child at home, and he's like, what happened? And so he has to go back, fix it, and then there's his child again. He understands that if he loves and treasures this child, that he must accept and make peace with those things in the past that resulted in this life being born. Because the times of life are interconnected. And it's not far-fetched to think Joseph experienced something like this. Compounded, of course, by the knowledge that both suffering and prosperity had their place in God's purpose. So shall we accept good from the Lord's hand and not trouble? That's what Job says. In other words, even if you could go back and change it, don't be so sure that you would. Especially when you don't know how interconnected all the times are. How the good, which turns into trouble, also turns back to good. How the good and the bad are mingled together often, so that you don't get some of the good without some of the bad. And how those who know how to weep really know what it means to laugh. So what can we do in the end? Except trust the Lord with each day as it comes, knowing that the times and the seasons are all in his hands. Suffering will test our trust in the Lord, but so will prosperity. And though suffering may tempt us to doubt and despair, prosperity will tempt us toward pride and self-reliance. Give me neither poverty nor riches. It's almost as if I don't have enough wisdom to know whether one or the other of those seasons is really what I need in my life right now. So I'm left without control. The only thing I can do is trust in the Lord's wisdom. But I can also pray that whatever comes to me from him will be made to serve a purpose for him. Let's pray.